It is, like most seaports, a long, narrow, disagreeable, ill-built town. The houses in general occupied by those trades adapted to the commerce of the shipping and seafaring person. The victualling office and the two breweries being the only tolerably built houses in it. Edward Hasted, writing about Chatham in 1798. My name is Robert Flood, and today I want to take you on a journey back to Chatham in the early 19th century. Although very different from the Chatham we know today, the road layout and building lines would be familiar for the most part. Chatham began its life as a small fishing village, shown in AD 915 as one half of the hundred of Chatham and Gillingham. The Domesday Survey of 1085 records that Chatham had been given by Odo, the Bishop of Bayeux, to Robert Latin. It's shown as being taxed at 6 shillings, with the mill valued at 32 pence. The manor itself contained 1,600 acres of land, with 20 acres of meadow and woodland. Fishermen's huts stood along the water's edge in the shadow of the church. Latin was the son of Hamo de Crèvecoeur, and his family built the first Leeds castle. The old Bourne wells up at a springhead in Luton Valley and used to make its way along the low ground we know today as the brook, to empty into the mill pond that was on the site running from what's now B&M across the old Riverside car park to the bus station. The water would have made its way down Holborn Lane to fill the mill pond and drive the water mill. I'd like to think that the mill and mill pond look something like this. The mill dates back beyond the Norman conquest, although the first record of it is in 1085. Robert Latin's manor house stood 150 yards from the willow-fringed bank of the old Bourne, and was approximately on the site now occupied by Primark. This is an example of a typical Norman manor house. British Home Stores stood on the site for many years, and prior to that, the Mitre Hotel and Pub, where Nelson stayed, and the London Dover coach would stop. From the evidence of Domesday, we can work out that the population of Chatham in 1086 would have been about 350 people, mainly aged and young, as the working age people had either fled or had fallen at the Battle of Hastings. The population of the area tended to hover around 200 to 300 over the following few hundred years. Occasional outbreaks of plague and frequent scarcity and famine produced by poor harvests meant that the town didn't get much bigger. Everyone was employed either in working the vast expanse of local wheat and barley fields, in animal husbandry or fishing. Sheep were kept for both meat and wool, and they were grazed on the low-lying marshland close to the river. This marshland was the cause of much of the illness in Chatham, with malaria-carrying mosquitoes spreading marsh fever, an English strain of malaria that is less virulent and deadly than its tropical counterpart, but very debilitating. The year of 1568 was to bring enormous change to Chatham and the surrounding area, as it went from being an unassuming backwater to the heart of a huge industrial and military complex with the foundation of the Royal Dockyard. The mill pond became its southernmost boundary, and there was a massive population increase with workers coming to help with the construction of the dockyard. Reclamation of the marshlands bounding the old Bourne began in earnest in the 1620s, as the old wattle and daub structures gave way to more permanent housing for dockyard employees. A few cottages were built on the marshy subsoil of what is now Military Road. The old manor house was demolished in the late 1600s, so the only remaining links to the medieval village of Chatham were the church on the hill and the mill and pond. In 1710, 2 Acts of Parliament were passed, and the Crown purchased all Chatham Mill, with all buildings, dam, ponds, banks, drains, etc., in the holding of Anne Monk, including that part of the mill pond joining to the church grounds near Chatham Quay. The Surveyor General of Crown Lands wrote a report in 1740 describing 116 small tenements in Chatham, in very poor repair, inhabited chiefly by fishermen, labourers and other poor people. At this time the mill and mill pond disappeared from the records, and the land is in the possession of officers of the Ordnance as a precursor to it becoming the gun wharf. As the dockyard grew, so the bounds of Chatham did too. The area we now know as Medway Street and its junction with the High Street developed with tightly packed industry supporting the expanding workforce. Large victualling yards occupied the land west, crossing the boundary line with Rochester. Between 1760 and 1820, based on the number of rateable properties Chatham had doubled in size. All but the grandest houses, such as Chatham House, the family home of the best brewers, were constructed of timber. As can be expected, fires were not unusual in towns made mostly of wooden buildings. In fact, what's surprising is that they didn't happen more often. These are the type of buildings prevalent in Chatham around this time. This particular image is of Fullalove Alley, now known as Bachelor Street. And this one shows the cottages in Ship Lane, looking up from Ship Pier towards the synagogue. Chatham's two great fires of 1800 and 1820 are particularly of note, as it's unlikely that they would have been contained in the way they were without the presence and assistance of the military. The 1800 fire in particular could have resulted in the entire destruction of Chatham. In May of 1800, a new iron foundry had caught fire. The foundry was next door to the victualling yard, and the employees working there reacted quickly to bring their fire pumps to the scene. The foundry was completely destroyed, but the fire was prevented from spreading. The weather throughout May and June 1800 had been extraordinarily hot. Inside the small, poorly built wooden houses, it would have been stifling and malodorous. In 1800, 442 deaths were recorded locally. That's 40 in every 1,000. And with an average life expectancy of 30 in Chatham, the town was one of the unhealthiest in Kent. Just before midday, on the last day of June, a fire started in a large shed on the riverbank. This shed stored oakum and cordage, and is shown as number 61 on this plan, behind the high street and immediately adjacent to the river. Not only were the contents of the shed highly combustible, but the shed itself was constructed of freshly tarred timber. Because the fire broke out an hour before the ebb tide, it was almost impossible for the arriving fire pumps to draw water from the river. Ahoy, a small cargo vessel that was moored at a nearby quay, was unable to escape the speed of the conflagration and was sunk where it stood. Over the course of the next 3 hours, an area from Best Brewery in the east, all the way to the boundary with Rochester at the John Hawkins Hospital, extending down to the river's edge, was destroyed. 95 dwelling houses, including warehouses and 6 pubs. On this plan, the dotted line denotes the area inside which everything was destroyed. People fled the buildings with those belongings they could carry and took refuge in the fields behind the high street. Dockyard firemen, under the Commissioner F.J. Hartwell, eventually brought the fire under control. Butts from the dockyard and victualling yards were used, and dockyard workers helped to pull down buildings with pikes to create fire breaks. In addition, the parish pump and those belonging directly to the Best Brewery were used, and troops from the Marine and Chatham barracks were brought in to deter the less scrupulous from stealing property from the abandoned houses in the line of the fire. These thieves are known as fire priggers. Loss of life was mercifully small, and only 4 people succumbed. One of these was William Bassett, a servant of the Best family. Despite warnings, he ran back into his burning house to collect some money he'd left, at which point the building collapsed and he was buried in the burning ruin. Many were injured, including a man burnt by falling molten lead, someone burnt by vitriol, and a man who had his legs broken when he was run over by a fire appliance. After the fire, a committee of relief was established, and the great and the good of the town did a door-to-door collection. Major donors to the fund included the city of Rochester with St Margaret's and the Dean and Chapter of Rochester Cathedral. 845 dockyard men gave varying amounts from 6pence to 7 shillings, and the Royal Marines and Upper Barracks gave over £50. The Chatham brewers, Richard and James Best, gave £25, but drew no money from the relief fund, even though they had lost a number of tied pubs. The 6 public houses destroyed in the fire are shown on this map. At number 2, the 3 Tuns, number 60, the Trumpet, number 70, the Britannia, number 78, the Cross Keys, number 82, the Union Flag, and number 87, the Prince of Orange. The minutes of the Relief Committee give a great snapshot of the social makeup of those affected by the fire, with many of the buildings tenanted by artisans, amongst them blacksmiths, carpenters and shipwrights. There are also massively overcrowded properties, with many families living under one roof, one in particular that had been subdivided into 10 rooms housing 15 adults and 10 children. After the fire, life settled back down and many buildings, warehouses and pubs were rebuilt. Mr. Jeffries, the Relief Committee chairman, stated that if the contents of his 1800 report should, in the least degree, contribute to facilitate the proceedings of a future committee in case of a similar calamity, the views of the publisher will be amply gratified. And gratified they were when 20 years later, Chatham suffered another devastating fire, and Mr. Jeffries stood up to the plate once again to provide for the poor of the parish who had suffered loss in the inferno. Early in the morning of the 3rd of March 1820, a fire started in the outbuildings at the back of 2 houses in the High Street. The bakehouse of William Hills in the High Street was near what was described as Town Quay, shown as number 69 on this plan. This was adjacent to the warehouse of Jane Burdett, a tallow chandler, shown at number 70. The cause of the fire is uncertain as it took hold so quickly. Both Mr. Hill's and Mrs. Burdett's buildings were made of timber and full of combustible material. It's assumed that a strong northwesterly wind blowing off the river took ashes from the ovens or furnaces, and this sparked some of the materials stored in the buildings. Thankfully, the fire was spotted quickly. A waterman called Joseph Joyce rowed his boat on shore at Town Quay and raised the alarm. At the same time, a guard on duty at the Chatham Barrack Gate alerted the officer in command, Lieutenant Larrymore, and he took a portion of his guard into town to rouse the households in the vicinity of the fire. Undoubtedly, this was the key factor in there being no loss of life. Within a few hours of the fire starting, 34 houses and 13 warehouses were destroyed, including Chatham House and the adjoining brew house. The fire rapidly spread to the High Street and breached the road. In half an hour, the flames raged with so much violence that close approach to fight them was almost impossible. Luckily, the tide was in, so the water pumps were well supplied from the river, but the fire outwitted those fighting it. By 3 o'clock in the morning, just 1 hour after the fire was first spotted, it looked like it would get out of control as the rising embers were carried at great speed by the wind. These set light to Rome House barnyard and cornfields, about 500 yards away. Rome House stood in what we now call Railway Street, approximately on the junction with Best Street. As the wind carried the embers, it reached Gibraltar Place and formed a vast current of fire along the new road for a distance of at least a quarter of a mile. Men were stationed on the tops of buildings and haystacks to throw buckets of water on the glowing embers as they fell. The water thrown formed an icy surface which deadened the embers and prevented the fire from spreading further. By 4 a.m, the fire had reached its height. The Sun Inn, shown at number 44 on the map, on the junction of the High Street and Medway Street, was destroyed. The fire spread to Chatham House, a substantial mansion that stood across the bottom of what we now know as Manor Road, and in the occupation of the Best brewing family. The flames spread to the adjacent brew house and engulfed the steam engine that had been supplying water at a rate of several tons a minute to help fight the fire. The residents were forced into the street on a freezing and windy night in nothing more than their bedclothes, and many risked their lives to rescue their furniture and effects. An eyewitness stated, "Everyone possessed of the common feelings of humanity was struck with dismay and despair at the appalling sight, and this terror was rendered more awfully visible by the prodigious glare of the flames, which illuminated the countenances of those who were present at the awful scene." Although Chatham House was completely destroyed, its substantial and solid walls created a firebreak, and the flames were prevented from spreading any further east. It's worth noting that as proof of the intensity of the fire, some of the timbers and coals removed from the ruins of Chatham House were still glowing 5 weeks after it happened. Once again, engines from the dockyard, ordnance and victualling office were employed to bring the fire under control, and by 9 o'clock in the morning, the flames were subdued. After this second fire, a committee of relief was again established to help the victims under the guidance of William Jeffries. The committee was made up of many officers who had helped with their men to fight the fire, including Colonel Passley from the Sappers and General Robert Darcy of the Royal Engineers. John Dickens, Charles's father, was part of this committee in his role as the clerk of the Royal Navy Pay Office. With echoes of the 1800 fire, thieves were again an issue, and 16 priggers were arrested, tried and convicted, although many more were acquitted for lack of evidence. The Relief Committee again carried out a door-to-door collection, and letters requesting financial assistance were sent to 84 towns and villages in Kent. The newly elected members of Parliament for Rochester, Lord Binning and Ralph Burnell Esquire, gave £50 each. In total, over £2,000 was collected, and the committee called for residents to submit their claims. Things were complicated, as the pawnbroking businesses owned by Thomas Frid and Asher Cohen were lost in the fire. Statements of losses included coats of fine cloth, gold and silver watches, silk, satin and velvet dresses, telescopes, pictures, books and fine furniture. Claims totalled £5,300 and many were deemed fraudulent. Over 200 claims on pawned items were not substantiated, and eventually the committee was wound up in October 1820. The committee stated that they were aware that injustices could have been done, but had been unable to see any other way out of their situation, and thanked the public in general for giving them credit for the exertion of their best endeavours. Many of the buildings destroyed by the fire were owned by the Best Brewing family and by the Richard Watts charity. Both organisations were well insured against loss, and the area was quickly rebuilt. Although there have been fires in Chatham since, nothing as extensive as those of 1800 or 1820 happened again, and they warrant the title, The Great Fires of Chatham.